Welcome back. Without a doubt, most countries on the African continent are plagued by impunity and need a proper establishment of the rule of law. That's where organizations like the International Criminal Court come in, especially when it comes to ensuring that the most severe crimes do not go unpunished and that international law is respected. Joining us to give us a better understanding of the role which the ICC plays or should be playing in bringing an end to impunity is former ICC prosecutor and partner at Charles Anthony LLP, and that's Dr. Charles Adeogun Phillips. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Now, what motivated the creation of the International Criminal Court in the first place?
Well, just like you said, it's the need to fight impunity amongst perpetrators of the worst crimes known to mankind. The forebearers of the ICC were the International Criminal Tribunals for Rwanda and that of the former Yugoslavia. And the need then arose to set up a permanent criminal court that would make people accountable for their crimes.
And so how well has the ICC performed in terms of curbing impunity?
Slowly. And the major challenge for the ICC is that it lacks enforcement powers. The ICC, like most international courts, does not have its own police force and therefore cannot enforce its own sanctions and relies primarily on the cooperation of states, member states of the United Nations or state parties of the Rome Statute to the ICC to actually get things done. And that has been bogged down by a lot of political positions taken either by member states of the United Nations or members of the Security Council.
Okay, so if the ICC has performed poorly, like you said, what can be done to turn things around?
I think there are two things. The first thing about it is for state parties to realize that the role of the ICC is merely to complement that of national jurisdictions. And so, to the extent feasible, most countries should strive to enact laws that would enable them to prosecute international crimes. That's the first step. The second step would be to enhance international cooperation among states. For example, in the case of Sudan and Libya, to actually get those countries to make their leaders accountable for violations of international humanitarian law. So a combination, as you've seen, with the Hussein Habre trial in Senegal, where the AU actually took a stand to set up a regional international court to prosecute that situation, and that was successfully done. That moving forward, one would expect that regions and countries will strive to set up their own regional international courts.
Well, you talked about Sudan and Libya. Now, let's take a look at Burundi, for instance, yes, which has a leader who appears to have turned deaf ears to various groups and even the international community. So how can the ICC come in?
Well, Burundi is not a state party to the International Criminal Court, and the only way that the conflict in Burundi, the situation in Burundi can be referred to the ICC would be by way of Security Council resolution. But then again, the African Union has plans to extend the scope of the current African Court on Peoples and Human Rights to cover a criminal jurisdiction. So if that does happen, then one would expect that the case of Burundi might be referred to the African Court.
Now, do you believe the ICC is biased against African leaders? Because we've seen some groups and even countries threatening to leave the ICC.
I wouldn't say the ICC is biased towards African leaders or African countries. It is regrettable that most of the situations referred to the court have emerged from our continent. But then again, the prosecutor of the court is an African, and a former colleague of mine, Fatou Bensouda. And I think that the court tends to lack the political will. I mean, there are conflicts in Palestine, there are conflicts in Iraq, there's a conflict going on in Syria, in Myanmar, and there's so many other countries where referrals could be made. It is regrettable that Africa has been the focus of the court.
Okay, and bearing in mind the way the ICC is perceived by African leaders, for instance, and looking at the limitations you've outlined, how can the ICC bring an end to impunity, as a matter of fact, and especially with respect to international law?
Well, the very presence of the court in the world serves as a deterrent, one would hope, to leaders and people who commit international crimes or alleged to have committed international crimes as a starting point. State cooperation, as I said at the beginning, the ICC has to do a lot of work to get a lot more countries to sign up to the ICC treaty. I think there are only 80 or 90 countries in the world, excluding America, of course, who de-ratified the ICC treaty, haven't signed. That's not been a good sign. There's an impression that they are lesser and greater mortals in the world. In other words, they are untouchable countries, and they are touchable countries. Africa has been the focus of the court, and one would expect that the court would expand its reach somewhat.
Now, talking about bias to African leaders, look at the Syrian crisis, for instance. We've not seen the ICC do much in terms of coming in and sorting these issues out. So does that support the proof of bias against some African leaders?
First of all, Syria is not a state party to the Rome Statute of the ICC. So that's a starting point. Then one wonders why there hasn't been a Security Council referral in the case of Syria. Well, the answer to that is obvious. Russia would exercise its veto powers and block any such referrals from the Security Council. So there seems to be an apparent conflict between the need for peace and security in the world. On one hand, you wave the wand of justice. On the other hand, the politicians frustrated. And it's not any different in this country.
So if you've talked about limitations in terms of limiting the ICC from performing some of its functions, how can this be reversed? Well, I think in the future,
the central point basically is that regional courts and countries have to domesticate the ICC treaty within their own laws and train and build capacity domestically for people to be able to investigate and prosecute international crimes. The biggest challenge to the court is that it relies on the cooperation of states. So if it relies on cooperation of states, why don't the states just do it themselves? That, moving forward, that would be the light at the end of the tunnel, as it were.
Thank you very much, Mr. Adeogu Phillips, for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Well, when we come back in a moment, more reactions trail the death of the late Stephen Keshi. Please stay with us.